Good morning and thanks for joining us for today's webinar regarding privileged attacks. I'm delighted to be joined today by David Higgins from Cyberark. Apologies for the lack of hold music today from the audience. We've had some technical issues in kicking off the webinar. Hopefully you can all hear me and see my screen, so the instruction screen to the webinar. Please do raise your hands using the chat function if you have any audio issues throughout the webinar, and we will get those addressed. I'm going to kick off assuming all is well and read you through our presentation today around securing the keys to your IT kingdom. So that's looking at privileged account security with our guest presenters from Cyberark. Just to give you a little bit of background into today's objective and what we are looking to share with you today, we want to give customers insight into how they can respond to the increased volume of breaches that exploit privileged accounts and passwords within the organisation, thereby minimising the impact of those attacks. So the format for today's webinar, we'll do a very brief Bytes intro. A few of you do know it already, so I will keep it brief. We'll talk you through recent attacks, what we need to learn from them, introduce Cyberark, and then Cyberark and David will take you through a detailed presentation on the role of privilege in advanced attacks, what you can do about locking down your most powerful accounts, and some of the analytics that are available in order to track and understand in an automated fashion what's going on with your privileged accounts. We'll then do a live Q&A at the end, which we'd be delighted if you had lots of questions for the presenters today. A little bit of housekeeping. First of all, attendee lines will be on mute throughout the webinar. Questions are welcome. We will do a few Q&A at the end, as I said, so please do post them for your questions in chat. We do keep discussions today to technical and strategic discussions, whereas of course we are absolutely happy to talk to you about commercials on any particular technologies offline and after the webinar. We will keep it to the the technical and the strategic today. So it's not designed to be a sales pitch, it's designed to talk about how you can address the issue of privileged account and attacks. We do have a survey at the end. Please do take the time to fill it in if you could. Just make sure that these sessions continue to meet the mark and are providing useful information for you. And lastly, a recording will be available at the end for everyone that has joined us today so that you can review the session at your leisure and share this insight within your wider teams. So a little bit about Bytes Security Partnerships. So we're an independent security reseller up until 4 years ago when we were purchased by the Bytes Group, and they have largely kept us as an independent IT security specialist within their group. What that allows us to provide customers is agility and specialism that you would expect from a small independent, but then have the backing and the resources to provide our customers that are available from a large software group. Some key points about us, we're very passionate about security education and the technology niches that we work with. This lends itself and shows itself in our partner statuses with with world-leading vendors such as Cyberark, Checkpoint, etc. We're very passionate about retaining the top levels of possible technical accreditation and support that we can provide people. And we're also proactive in our search for new technologies and how to help our customers and businesses out there future-proof their business against future threats, and that's one of the reasons we do sessions like today. So why is privilege an issue? Why has this become an issue in the press, and why are we talking to you about it today? So firstly, breaches have become far more professional. Hackers are increasingly seeking the maximum bang for their buck. So if they're going to be trying to infiltrate organisations, they are trying to identify the most powerful accounts, the most powerful routes in, so that they have to do the least possible to exfiltrate the most amount of data and do the most damage. That's firstly. Coupled with that, businesses are increasingly running far more complex IT estates. There's more privileged accounts, they're harder to track, harder to manually know what's going on with them, more passwords, and it just becomes a very, at the moment, tracking them manually is very difficult and therefore gives those attackers a route into the organisation. Privilege means attackers can do real damage when they get in much quicker. So they're able to actually, get to the absolute nitty-gritty of what makes the organisation work, changing passwords, exfiltrating data much quicker, and also with much less trail for security teams to follow. And stolen credentials, as we've seen with varied attacks in 2015 and continuing, they're one of the most common routes inside the firm. And Target were taken down by stolen credentials from one of their suppliers, and the list goes on and on of varied hacks that actually have had privilege at their heart. So with that in mind, I'm going to get off the line and hand over to David and Cyberark to talk to you about how you can create a strategy around protecting the privileged accounts in your organisation, how you can ensure your most powerful access points can be protected, and how you can know what's going on within your privileged estate. And that I'm just going to hand over to David from Cyberark. And thanks everyone for joining us, and I'll be back online for the Q&A at the end. David, are you on the line?
I am, yeah. Thank you very much. Hopefully you can see my screen.
I can indeed. I'm just going to put myself on mute now to avoid any feedback.
Great, thanks very much. Okay, good morning everybody. Thank you for your time today. So obviously in line with the kind of introduction, I guess wanted to set the context of my presentation today, which is probably linked to something you're all familiar with, I guess, a kind of change in approach and culture around breaches, and that the kind of mindset these days is not so much when you're going to be breached, but it's more a case of having the mindset that organizations have been breached and that they will be breached again, and looking at putting controls and processes in place with that mindset, actually having a slightly different view of looking to not prevent attacks, but actually prevent them from happening again, and when they do occur, actually provide kind of containment and limit the way that attackers can actually move within the organization. And that's going to be my focus really, is how do attackers, once they breach the perimeter, which is becoming quite a fuzzy line these days as to what the perimeter is, how do attackers achieve that kind of lateral movement? And from my focus here at Cyberark, which is focusing on privileged account security, we see that in 100% of data breaches, stolen credentials were used. And it's not just any type of credential here. Typically, we're talking about those admin level accounts, the administrative level accounts that allow attackers to move laterally within the organization to ultimately get to their target, to get where they want to be, whether that's to bring a system down, whether that's to steal data. It's the privileged accounts that attackers are after. And we're not just talking about state-sponsored attacks here. We're talking about cyber criminals, even hacktivists, and of course insider breaches. All very much have different political drivers, but they all have to get the same thing at some point, which is to get that privileged access. And it kind of introduces an additional security layer now when we have that mindset that actually, regardless of what the attackers are going to do, regardless of what they're after, privileged accounts is something that they need. We actually see a new security layer coming out through this. Of course, you've got the typical types of security, perimeter controls and monitoring, etc. But the heart of the enterprise needs to be protected, because these embedded accounts like root administrator or additional privileged accounts that have been created, named admin accounts, whatever it may be, these are the accounts that allow operational support users to move across the estate, to connect to servers, to connect to assets, to perform admin functions. So it's natural it's actually these accounts that attackers are after, because again, it allows them to move laterally across the estate and to get the access that they need. And I'll break down an example in a few slides' time to talk exactly how that's done. But I think before doing that, it's probably worth just introducing what is privileged, or what is a privileged account. I think probably a few years ago, if you'd ask people what privileged account is, they'd immediately just thought of, well, it's the root account in Unix, it's the administrator in Windows, it's those godlike accounts that come with every piece of software and hardware that you purchase that you can't get rid of, you actually need to set those systems up. But I feel the definition has really changed, or not changed, but evolved. Those accounts absolutely are part of privileged scope. But it's all the other accounts that actually are created and built. You know, our service accounts, application accounts, all the accounts on the various systems that you see, whether that just be on the premise data, but as we move across the cloud, more privileged accounts are introduced by this process because you've got the underlying virtualization, you've got the administrative accounts for things like AWS, Azure, etc. Even ACS systems, industrial control systems, all have privileged accounts within them to control those remote systems. And we even have accounts that we create for our admin users. So rather than give admin rights to their normal BAU account, we create secondary accounts, david.higgins.admin. And what we end up doing here is creating more and more privileged accounts. So we get to a position where most organizations have 3 to 4 times the number of privileged accounts than they do human users. And if you think about the amount of time that we invest and focus on things like identity access management, that's actually only therefore looking at maybe 20% of all the accounts that you have in your estate. That extra 80%, that's the focus of the attackers. They're the accounts that they want, because if they get hold of one of these privileged accounts, that's going to allow them to move across the estate. That's going to allow them to connect to databases that's holding your client or sensitive information. And maybe to kind of reposition the mindset here, if we think about perimeter controls and perimeter security, and if you purchase a new firewall and you patch that into your data center, the first rule that is always on a firewall is deny everything. And then what we do is we add the relevant rules in the firewall to allow the relevant access that we need out or in to the organization. When I talk to organizations about identity access, but more specifically about privileged access, this rule is actually kind of flipped on its head. We end up giving users full admin access because it allows them to do what they need to do, but it also allows them to do a hell of a lot more than they actually need to do. So the rule actually seems to be in privileged access, it's actually allow everything, and then retrospectively we'll try to find ways and means to strip back that access. And that actually becomes quite a complicated process. And it's very difficult to do. It's difficult to do obviously natively within operating systems or systems such as Windows, where there's no gray area. It is very much you're a full-blown admin or you're not. There's no nice middle ground. And various other solutions out there or systems, especially legacy ones, really struggle with that ability to control when users should be getting privileged access and when they're not. And we end up in a situation where we have kind of standing access, where our admin users, our support users, operation users have full admin access to the estate, which obviously they need the admin access. They need that to do their job. But they have the access whenever they want. There's no kind of control when they use their access. There's no kind of control or approval or workflow to say, okay, although you do need admin access to this server, you should only be using it in a genuine reason, such as maybe when there's an incident or there's a change to implement or a problem to respond to. It's that kind of free-roaming standing access that makes it difficult to control when privilege is being used, but also difficult to detect when privilege is being abused in an attack process. So going back to my earlier statistic, these accounts are used in 100% of data breaches. But if we don't have a good grasp on how they're being used or when they should be used, it's difficult to spot what is a genuine activity compared to what is a malicious activity, because a lot of these accounts are generic. We can't attribute them to an end user. So let me, I mentioned about kind of diving into a breach and talking about where privilege played a role. So I've got an example data breach here, which is of course based on a real life example, but for reasons of that customer, I will keep their name sanitized. What it always starts off with in these attacks, as you can imagine, and I'm sure you've heard many times, is it starts off with some kind of phishing attack. Specifically in this case, it was an executive spear phishing attack that went after execs of this organization. And their breach point, that line at the bottom of the slide represents the breach, or represents the perimeter. Their breach point was they went after executives in the company, they pinged them some emails, which obviously contained links and malware, and a single executive on that link opened the wrong attachment. Okay, so now they've breached the perimeter. And the thing that made the attacker's life even more easy in this place was that the executive user was actually running with local admin rights on his or her machine. And various reasons why that may have been, and I'm sure many of those reasons are jumping to mind right now, which is, the executive users sat at home, they want to install a printer, they want to install some new software, and Windows is saying you don't have admin rights. So obviously what do? They pick up the phone, they call IT support desk and say, I need the access to install this and I need it now. Okay, so what do? We can either give them the admin password, which we probably don't want to do because most organizations have the same admin password for every single workstation. So having the admin password for one workstation would allow me to log on to any workstation. So the next logical step is, well, we'll put their account and we'll put it in the local administrators group. Now that user is a local admin and can actually install whatever they want. And that's the danger. They can install whatever they want, or maybe stuff they're not aware of because they're clicking on links or opening attachments. And that's where this attack cycle started. That user opened an attachment that contained malware. It was deployed with local admin rights, and then the attacker was in. They had their initial footprint, their initial foothold. And what the attackers do at this point is they start looking for more access. And you'll see that the arrow there is cyclic, and that's a reason, because this happens several times in an attack process. And there's different techniques that they use. In this initial instance, what they did is they ran a process, or an attack process called pass the hash, which is specifically focused in the Windows environment. And for those of you not familiar, I'll just briefly skim over it. It's where every time you log into a Windows laptop, desktop, the credentials that you use are hashed on that machine, which is why if you're sat on the train or in the plane and you log in, it authenticates you. It doesn't need to continuously talk back to the domain controller. Your credentials are hashed within the machine. Now, a hash is a one-way algorithm, same input, same output. So what happened in this process is previously, 3 days prior to the attack or the breach occurring, a help desk administrator had actually logged on to this workstation, and their credentials were therefore hashed on that workstation. Now, the help desk administrator had then therefore logged into other workstations, other servers. You know, if it's a desktop support team, they of course need access to the desktops and the laptops, but they're probably also connecting to servers that are running antivirus, running various other things, backup monitoring, whatever it may be. That user was using the same account to access the desktops, their say .admin account, if you will, that they were using to access the servers. So when the attackers ran past the hash, they found a hash credential for this help desk user. And as it's a one-way algorithm, same input, same output, the same hash persisted on other machines that user had accessed. Now, what I've seen generally in the field is that these secondary admin accounts that we create in the Windows environment typically have non-expiring passwords, or they have a much longer expiration on the password because it becomes such an overhead for the support teams and the ops teams to remember to change these passwords. This made it, again, an additional footprint for the attacker. They could take this hash from the workstation and then use it to basically make a remote connection to other systems that user had connected to, and therefore started the process of the lateral movement, this repeated process that occurs in the attack cycle where the attackers are looking for credentials. So at this point, they gain access to a server. So now they've moved laterally from the workstation estate, from that tier, they're now in the server estate. And what are they looking for? Well, they're looking for more access continually. That might be a repeated process of pass the hash, over pass the hash. It might even be looking for hard-coded credentials. Attackers love hard-coded credentials because basically once they're on a server, they find a file that's got credentials in it, great. That might be an application, might be a script, it might be an application that's connecting to a database. And if they're after the database that's holding customer information and they find hard-coded credentials in a script on that server, their life becomes a hell of a lot easier. They've got the username, they've got the password, they've got the database details. There's not much more they need to do than just open up an ADPC connection string and they're in that database as an admin user. What happened actually in this specific attack cycle is they got access, admin access to the domain controller. And at this point in time, once they gain access to the domain controller, it's kind of the jackpot for the attackers. They can invoke something called a golden ticket attack, which will allow them to impersonate, basically write their own Kerberos tickets. They can impersonate any user in the organization. And these kind of attacks are very, well, I don't want to say very common, but these kind of attacks are executed a lot in the high-profile breaches that you would have heard of. And because the attackers can actually write their own Kerberos tickets, they can impersonate any user, it becomes very difficult for organizations to actually realize they're under attack and that attackers are moving around their organization. And it's not until usually a third party calls them up and say, do you know you've been breached, we're seeing your data all over the black market, that they realize they've been hacked. And I'd say that's a high percentage. In most attacks, it's not the organization who finds out. It's someone else telling them that they've been hacked, usually a government organization. Now, I've been working in this industry of privilege for about 8 years now, and I've seen various, I guess, practices that are make sense as to why they're being done. There's usually an operational reason why these processes are in place. But these processes as well make the attacker's life easier. It's these kind of processes, as well, of course, vulnerabilities on the machines themselves, but it's these kind of processes that attackers are leveraging. I mentioned one before, and I won't go through all of these one by one, but I'll just pick out a few. So local admin accounts, on whether that be Windows environments or Unix environments or the enable account in Cisco, etc., whatever it may be, these are accounts that at some point operation support teams are going to need. So if we've got 10,000 workstations, it's without a proper solution in place or process in place, the most logical option that organizations take is, well, we'll set the same build account, same build password on every workstation, and we'll store that password somewhere, maybe in a password protected spreadsheet, or we'll put it in a physical safe somewhere. But it's the same password on every single workstation. So if just one password is compromised, then of course I can now gain access as the local administrator to any workstation because it's the same password. Hard-coded credentials, I mentioned, are an easy loop for the attackers. In the clear passwords that are in a script, in a text file, makes it very easy for the attackers to gain access to these accounts. They just need to do that lateral movement, get onto a server where such a script exists. And it's not just passwords we're talking about here. It's also SSH keys, because both of these are used to achieve authentication. Authentication is a privileged account onto a target server. We see SSH keys used in a very similar way, not just obviously the fact that keys obviously reside on users' machines and servers, but they're also used by applications. They're used in scripts, they're used in codes. And without having visible where all the private and public keys are, again, it becomes very difficult to understand where the attack process could take place. It's very difficult to understand which keys are actually genuinely being used and which aren't. Because lack of visibility in the bottom right corner is one of the key issues here. And it's actually one of the reasons why many organizations move to kind of separate domain admin accounts for their admin users. We've shied away from using generic accounts because we want that accountability of who's accessing what system and when. And that kind of works to an extent for the auditing on the local operating system. But we still have the problem of generic accounts. The admin account exists, the root account exists, SA exists. We can't get away from the problem of generic accounts. But of course, many organizations create these secondary admin accounts in the Windows space so they know who it is connecting to a server at a particular point in time. The challenge with that actually, and the reason I've got it listed here as being a process to expose, is it creates more admin accounts. And typically these named admin accounts that we create are set to non-expiring passwords because the admin teams complain that they're constantly having to remember 2 or 3 passwords and constantly change them. They usually have standing access as well, so they might be actually just simply plonked into the domain admin group and therefore have blanket access to all the servers in the estate. They're an ideal target for the attackers. Get hold of one of those accounts, I can now access pretty much any server in the estate. It's a full admin account. Okay. So as I say, I don't want to go through all of these, but these are just examples of things that I've picked out over my time working in the industry as to potential processes that attackers can expose. Now, obviously compliance and auditors have a view on this, and I wanted to share the compliance view when it comes to privilege before I kind of go through best practices as to how to mitigate the impact of a breach. These are excerpts I've taken from just 2 compliance regulations around SOX and PCI, and it is something the regulator is aware of. It is something the regulators are driving home. You should address the privileged accounts, the admin accounts that give us access to sensitive data and customer data. The challenge with the compliance and regulator view is usually it's only focused on a subset of systems, our PCI relevant systems, our SOX relevant systems. It's not a view that takes place across the entire estate. Attackers' view, though, is that they're not, if one element's secure, they're going to look for that hole. They're going to constantly probe, especially those kind of state-sponsored attacks, those persistent threats. They're constantly probing, and they're looking for those weaknesses. They're looking for those holes in the fence that will allow them to get access to your organization. So although our PCI-related servers or our SOX-related servers may be locked down, we've still got chinks in the armor. We've still got these servers that we don't see as much of a risk, but actually once those servers are compromised, then there's routes and accesses from there into the arrested estate that will eventually allow them access to those more locked down systems. So what I want to talk about now is how to reduce the risk of privileged account exploits. As mentioned in the stat, right, 100% of the time, these accounts are used in breaches, in attacks. So how can we go about reducing the risk associated with what attackers are doing? And I think, you know, the logical thing to mention here is, you know, there is no foolproof solution. There is no 100% silver bullet that's going to make sure that no organization is ever breached. And in fact, going back to my very first slide, the mindset that I'm seeing more and more is, we've been breached, we're going to be breached again. What can we do to contain that breach? I think that's the key thing here. Not necessarily be of the mindset, oh yeah, no one's going to get into our organization, because the perimeter is so blurred these days, going through, you know, third parties, going through, you know, cloud, etc., that the perimeter is becoming very blurred. So the likelihood is your perimeter will be breached. And the question really is, how do you contain that breach? How do you stop the attackers moving laterally? Well, the first thing is obviously just to ask some sensible questions. Review your current privileged access workflows, your current privileged access methodology, and look to implement a standardized strategy for controlling that access. And I'll come back to this point and talk about some best practices and ways and means to do this. But it's an approach that needs to be taken on every single layer within your IT estate, not just at the OS layer, but we're talking about your network infrastructure, we're talking about your databases and your applications, business applications as well. You know, when we talk about network, it's not just, you know, your switches and your routers, but what about your remote KVM access, your ILO and DRAC access? All of these layers have privileged accounts within them, and all of them will be leveraged if they can by the attackers. And this is a nice video that I think represents the attack process that I just talked about. And actually, if you looked, we can logically break down the tiers of access. So the attackers, first of all, the endpoint, that's the external facing point, that's what they go after. Once they're on the endpoints, they then want to get into your organization. They want to move up to the next tier, to the server estate. Then once they're there, if they can get onto a domain controller, they can use something like Golden Ticket. They can start impersonating any user that they want. And what I often see is that organizations have the same accounts that can access all three tiers. So if I can compromise an account that's accessing workstations, accessing servers, accessing domain controllers, that lateral movement becomes a lot more easier. One of the best practices coming out, you know, not just from Cyberark, from Microsoft, is saying, well, let's break down the access. Let's stop this lateral movement. Let's stop this kind of moving between tiers that takes place, and actually look at that containment again. What do I do if my endpoints are breached? Well, let's contain the access. If they find an account, and the attackers are going to look for an account, if they find an account on a workstation, that account shouldn't be able to move vertically, just horizontally. Create a set of accounts that are specifically focused purely for the management of the workstations and nothing else. The accounts can access those workstations, should not be permitted to access the servers. And the accounts that access the servers shouldn't be permitted to access the domain controllers. So it's looking at, again, that kind of containment. Now, creating these tiers creates some management overhead. You know, how do we manage this so that if I'm a user that needs to access all three tiers, does that mean I have 4 accounts, 5 accounts? And again, I'll come back to this, how we approach this within the Cyberark space, about allowing users to get the access that they need and nothing more, and make sure we've got these tiers, these isolations. We're making that breach difficult. We're making that a lateral movement more difficult. And actually, before doing this, the first thing actually to understand is, what is your current position? Because most organizations don't have a good grasp of where all the privileged accounts are. Projects are spun up, service accounts are created for those projects. They're maybe not necessarily documented centrally or in a kind of standardized way. And the visibility of where all these accounts becomes slightly blurred. It's also difficult for organizations to understand how their accounts are being used. So right, again, focusing here on Windows, but we're talking all infrastructure here, not just Windows. But if I dive into Windows, what happens if I have an account? Do I know what services is running, scheduled tasks, application pools, etc.? You know, many of these accounts are non-expiring, so clearly a best practice is to make sure these passwords rotate on a regular basis. If I change the password for a domain account, is that going to break a service? How do I know where it is? So one of the things that we do at Cyberark is, and this tool that you're seeing on the screen is our DNA tool. It's a free of charge utility. And we provide it to customers and prospects alike to help their understanding of what their privileged account scope is right now. Where are all the privileged accounts? And what it does is it scans the estate, Windows and Unix, and it comes back with a report line by line of every account that exists that has access to the servers, when that account was last used, when the password was last changed. And in the Windows world, it will also start to map out your vulnerability to attack techniques such as pass the hash. So what it's saying here is if a particular file server was compromised here, file server 1. If that one server was compromised and an attacker ran past the hash, where could they move to laterally? Where else could they get to in your estate? And that's what those black arrows denote. This is just one server needs to be compromised for the rest of the estate, but you can see they're linked by black arrows. And this is exactly what the attackers are doing. It's that continual looking for credentials to allow them to move where they need to be. They never land where they want to end up. They move several times across the estate looking for that access. And what I've got next is actually an example from the field. This is the results from a UK organization who ran this utility. And as you can see, one server being compromised and the map pretty much goes black. The arrows go everywhere. And this comes back to that standing access that I talked about, the number of accounts that we have out there that could access any server, any workstation in our estate. And when we come back to that containment, it becomes difficult, right? Just that one server being compromised. The attackers are going to be able to move to any of the other blocks that you can see on the slide. So let's talk a little bit about best practices. I've been talking about all the problems, but what can we do to implement that kind of containment? Well, I think the first thing and the most logical thing is putting processes in place to protect and manage these privileged accounts. And it's not just the passwords, it's the SSH keys as well. So creating a control point, securing these accounts in a digital vault, so taking them out of things like KeyPass, taking them out of things like spreadsheets with a password on them, and putting them in a lockdown, hardened environment where there's multiple tiers of encryption, and that these accounts are being managed. So on a regular basis, the passwords and the keys are being rotated, whether that be every 30 days or after use. We're rotating them, we're setting them to be different passwords in every machine, so even though it's the same username, administrator, the local admin on every workstation or root in the Unix, we're making sure that on each instance of that account is a different password being set. And we create a control point by this. So we now have a situation where all our privileged accounts are being managed, they're set to a unique random value that the IT teams don't know, and it's a control point. So now as an IT admin user, what I need to do is I need to go to your vault. I need to request access to that credential. And therefore what we can do is we can define access controllers. We can make sure that the right users are getting the right access at the right time, but we're making it more difficult for either that malicious insider or that external attacker to find credentials because they're now locked away, they're encrypted, they're continually rotating. The pass the hash becomes more difficult because the same hash isn't residing in multiple machines, because we could enforce things like one-time password. After I've used an account, it's then automatically changed by the system. So the hash that's on one system will be different to the other. Again, just making that process, that lateral movement more difficult. Start to look at that containment. Having a central repository for accounts means that we could also start looking at those tiering that Microsoft recommend. I could log into the Vault and actually see my workstation account, my server tier account, and my domain controller tier account. I don't need to know the passwords anymore. I just need to know that I have access to the Vault, and that access is governed with two-factor authentication. It's integrated with change management, so I'm only getting access to these accounts if I've got a genuine change record or incident record or problem number. Okay. The next thing to address is how are the users actually gaining access to these systems? Going back to the attack cycle, one of the things that's compromised is the fact that those users typically have network access, direct network access to the sensitive assets, what they're supporting, what they're managing. Our recommendation is to break that. It's to provide isolation, make it difficult for the malware that's running on a desktop to have access to your critical assets, provide a layer of containment. We're talking about here kind of brokering sessions, not sending credentials to the end user, actually launching the session for a user on a proxy server and then connecting them to where they need to be. So the users still get the access that they need. It's just the route that they take is through a hop. So that malware can't see the sensitive assets anymore. All it can see is it can see your brokers. It makes that containment feasible. It starts to create that containment that makes it difficult for the attackers to start moving around and isolates your sensitive assets. And what we can also do here is now if we're brokering access, we can actually start monitoring what users are doing without having to worry about the complication of agents. We can actually monitor all the sessions running on the broker and start to understand command by command, keystroke by keystroke, exactly what your admin users, whether they be internal or external users, are actually doing on your systems. Eradicate hard-coded passwords. It's a logical one. The visual on the slide is deliberate. Putting hard-coded passwords in scripts and text files is almost like leaving the keys in the door. I get onto a server that's got a hard-coded credential in a script, then I've got the key I need to connect to that database that may be containing customer information, may be containing sensitive assets. Our approach recommendation is actually to take the passwords out of those scripts, eradicate hard-coded passwords, put them in the vault, put them with the rest of your interactive accounts, and then provide mechanisms and processes for those applications, the scripted processes, to request the password on the fly as it needs it. And what we can then do is authenticate the application, make sure it is a genuine application requesting the password. And because the password is no longer hard-coded, we've eradicated that problem of attackers seeing it, but we're also making sure that these passwords, which are typically non-expiring, are now being managed, because we can put them in those additional controls I mentioned before. We can put them in the vault, rotate the password on a regular basis, and the application doesn't care. It just needs to know that it calls the vault, it calls Cyberark every time it wants the password. And this is all now starting to reduce the risk, starting to mitigate the risk associated with the privileged account exploits. But there's other areas as well that we need to address. One is that this kind of, as you can probably guess from the slide, this kind of one ring rules them all approach, where you've got this one admin account that has full admin access across a server or multiple servers. Typically, though, when we think about who's accessing machines, say it's a DBA who's accessing a Unix server, they may be allowed to SU to root because they've got to do maintenance on the database, and some of the commands that they need to run on the Unix estate need them to be root level. So the easiest thing, well, look, you can SU to root. But that DBA doesn't need to do everything. They don't need to create new users, reset passwords, format disks, etc. There's only a small subset of commands that they need to do. Same thing applies on the Windows estate. There's only a small subset of things that users genuinely need to do. So the best practice recommendation is once those privileged accounts are under control, they're in a vault, they're rotated, they're managed, we're monitoring their usage, is then actually start to string back access. Implement least privilege. Give users the commands and the access that they need, but nothing more. So implement kind of on-demand elevation of rights. But then also address why, going back to my attack example, why users have full admin access on their workstation. Why that user said, I need admin access, because they just want to install an application. So then also implementing application whitelisting, blacklisting, and also graylisting on the endpoint estate, making the deployment of malware, again, making that process more difficult. Actually controlling which applications we're going to allow to install. Rather than giving the user full admin access, we'll say, well, look, here's our trusted apps in our whitelist. Here's the ones we clearly don't like in the blacklist. And any of those that we don't know, developers are always key for this, constantly finding new applications they want to install. Any of those that we don't know, we may allow to install, but we're going to isolate what it can do. We're going to say it can't access file shares. It can't call back to the internet. It can't call home if it's a piece of malware. And we're going to keep it in that kind of contained state until we get better understanding of what that application is. So our solution also approaches that, both the least privilege on the server estate, but also that application control on the endpoint estate, looking to protect you from end to end when it comes to these privileged account exploits. And everything I've talked about so far is very much on that kind of protection and containment side. The other key thing is that detection and response. Knowing that in 100% of attacks, privileged accounts are used, we know what the attackers are going after. Therefore, we can also have focused analytics when it comes to detecting threats. And that's our approach as well. We have a threat analytics tool that specifically focuses on privileged account activity and flags when suspicious activity is occurring. Now that could be excessive usage, strange location, users suddenly connecting from an IP address that they don't typically connect from, and that's often the case in attacks, right? These attacks that are done by state-sponsored attackers typically are coming from a different part of the world, and strangely enough, those people like to operate 9 till 5 in their local time zone, but it's not the local time zone of the user that's been exploited. It could be also looking at whether someone's trying to circumvent your controls. The other thing that we're doing as well is actually we're providing a solution that allows you to detect when techniques such as pass the hash, overpass the hash, or golden ticket are being used. So it will actually alert you, do you know someone's exploited your system, they're using golden ticket, you need to respond to that. In some situations, a solution will respond automatically, maybe issue a password reset. But the main thing is it's giving you that visibility, it's allowing you to detect yourselves when you've been attacked, as opposed to waiting months before you get a phone call from a government organization telling you that you have been. So this is also key, is that you need to combine both the proactive controls and the detection techniques together so that you're containing you're making it more difficult for the attackers to move around, you're containing that breach, you're monitoring the usage, and you've got that analytics piece sitting on top to let you know when potentially it's taken place. And to visualize how we kind of see everything hanging together, this is our standardized approach for privileged access. This is what we're seeing many organizations now adopt as an approach or reaction to what we're seeing when it comes to these high or these sophisticated attacks. It's looking to provide a standardized approach for not just your internal admins, but your third parties that you're outsourcing services to. A standardized approach for them to gain privileged access, controlling the way that applications gain access as well. Doing that account management, controlling those accounts so that they're managed, they're encrypted, they're protected. We're monitoring what users are doing with those accounts, and we're providing that threat detection to ultimately mitigate the risk and reduce the attack surface associated to privileged accounts. And then we're integrating with things like SIEM solutions, just a selection shown on the screen, so that this is now becoming part of your overarching cybersecurity strategy. This isn't a separate process. This is integrated with the SIEM. This is integrated with your change management solutions. And it's standardizing that approach for users to gain privileged access into your estate. So kind of next steps, what I suggest as a takeaway or a next step when looking at this particular area of security. Firstly, contact your Byte representative to talk about the DNA tool that I mentioned. This is a free of charge utility. It doesn't require installation. We send it as an executable that you can put on a workstation, put on a server. And what it will do, as I mentioned before, is it will scan your server estate. And it will come back with all the privileged accounts, where they are, how they're being used, when they were last used, when the password was last set. So you start to get an understanding of how many compliant accounts you have. And when I say compliant, passwords being changed within your policy of, say, 60 days or 90 days. It will also scan in the Unix world. It actually give you a similar map to what you see for pass the hash, but for SSH keys. Show you where your keys are, your key trusts, where the private and public keys are. It also goes on to scan application servers such as WebSphere, WebLogic, to give you an understanding of where hard-coded credentials are in JDBC connection strings as well. So increasing your visibility of where all your privileged accounts are, because that's the baseline. You need to understand where you are right now before you can get to where you want to be. Once up and running, we also have a threat assessment report, which is linked to the analytics engine. So this threat assessment report analyzes all the privileged access that's taking place and comes back with the kind of most suspected accounts of credential theft, the accounts that you need to look into. And that's the key thing with the threat analytics, is because we're targeting just privileged accounts, it's providing some, I need to see the wood from the trees. Actually saying, you had 10,000 connections that took place today, but it's these 5 that you want to look into. It's these 5 that could actually potentially be the telltale signs of insider abuse or malicious activity from an external party. Again, if you're interested in this, contact your Bytes representative and we'll happily get this set up for you. From my side, these are all the slides that I want to run through. As I say, my aim was to give you an understanding of how we perceive privileged accounts being exploited in the attack process and what some of the best practices and approaches that we're taking to help organizations lock themselves down and become a much tougher target from the attacker's perspective. So at this point, I think we've got a few minutes left in terms of the session, but really hand back over to the team at Bytes and see if there are any questions that came through and take it from there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. David, can you just confirm you can hear me?
I can indeed, yeah.
Lovely. So at this point, we haven't had any questions come through during the presentation, but if you've got anything that you'd like to ask David regarding privilege analytics, regarding common threat routes, etc., please do take the time to pop those in the questions box, and then we'll pose those to David, answer them on the line, and any that may be coming across that need further follow-up, we can obviously pass to your account managers at Bytes as well. I'll just give it 30 seconds or so, give you a minute or so to pop some thoughts down, some questions down, and all that remains for me to do, apart from that, really is to thank David for his very comprehensive presentation today. Thank you all very much for taking time out of your very busy schedules to listen to the webinar today, and just reiterate as well that the session session has been recorded, so we'll make sure that that's shared with you within the next couple of days. And also please do take the time to fill in the short survey at the end so we can make sure that these such sessions are providing relevant and useful information for you. So I'll just give you 30 seconds more to a minute to see if there's any other questions, and otherwise we'll get off the line and let you get on with the rest of your day. Okay, so I haven't had any further questions come through. I can assume that David's just given a fairly comprehensive overview, certainly food for thought on the subject of privilege and how you can think about managing those types of threats to your organisation. Thank you very much, David, for joining us today. Thanks everyone for their time in joining us, and I look forward to welcoming you to future webinars in the future. Thank you very much. Thanks everyone.
Thank you.